Hello, how are you? It's so good to have you with me today. This is Carmen Wimberly Cawthon, and again today I'm talking about race matters. Today we decided we would focus on justice and public safety as well as policy and politics, mostly policy. First thing I want to talk to you about though is when we say systemic racism, what do we mean? So, systemic racism means that the racism is built into the system, not just one system in America, but all the systems. Think about it like this: if you had a pond and you had fish in your pond, and somebody was systematically pouring water, putting something in the water. Actually, let's don't look at a pond. Let's look at, if you remember the Valdez, that might be a while before you, but the tanker Valdez poured oil. Oil came off of the ship and went into the ocean. And what happened there? The creatures that lived in the ocean started to die. Not just one, because if one animal dies, if something's wrong with one, you just think it was something wrong with that one. But all the animals started to die. And then they began to find that they were coated with the tanker oil. That's what systemic racism is like. So you didn't do something to affect just one person, but eventually it began to affect all the people who looked like that. So in our case, we're talking about black and brown people. So if there was mistreatment of one, and policies began nation was seeped all the way across the country, where people were moving and living. If they've been taught that black people, brown people were less than them, then they carried that through everywhere they went. So if a wagon train went across the country to California, that carried with them. If a group of people moved to the north, to the northwest, that carried with them. If people were living in the South and they moved somewhere else, that carried with them. So systemic racism got baked into the system. It was baked in policies, it was baked in laws, it was baked in just how people treated each other. The Racial Equity Institute uses the description of fish in the water. So if you see one fish turned upside down, you don't think anything of it. But if you look out in your pond and all the fish are turned up dead, you think something's wrong with the water. So that's the groundwater principle, and that's the principle that racism has moved across this country under. And it's not something new. It's been here forever. Since the English came over and began to colonize America, and slaves began to be brought over. So from there, let's talk a little bit about the justice and political system, justice and public safety system. So if you think that the police have always been in America, that's not true. We didn't even know them as police. There were constables and slave patrols in the South and constables in the North. So there were night watchmen. So you've heard of the night watchman from Paul Revere, if you remember that. So the night watchman was someone who was hired to just kind of walk the streets and make sure that prostitution wasn't going on or illegal activities weren't going on. That first started in Boston in the 1600s. New York and Philadelphia also created those things in the late 1600s, early 1700s. But those weren't people that everybody wanted to be around. A lot of times, they were people who they were mean, they were thugs, and they would just be hired because they knew that they were big and bad enough to stop any trouble that would be handled. And people began to pay them. People would pay. Sometimes the city or town would pay. these folk to make sure that there weren't problems on. Um, and uh, the night watch officers were overseen by what was called a constable. That wasn't a highly sought after job either. So, if you, so this is a quote from an article that I've read. It said, if you were rich enough, you paid someone to do it for you. Ironically, a criminal or a community thug. So by 1838, cities, as they, had more and more people, because remember, we started out as a rural country. Um, as cities grew, they needed some way to help um, keep prostitution and gambling down. And so they would hire a group of people. The first organized police force was in Boston. That was started in 1838. The merchants would save money by giving something to the cost of maintaining a, quote, police force for the common good. That's where that came from. So that hasn't always been with us. In the South, men were generally hired not so much to keep the community safe, but to keep the community safe from slaves who would run away because they didn't want to be slaves anymore. Those were called slave patrols. And that was an economic system as well. So it's all based, most of the things in our country are based on the economics of what was going to help the people who had the money, what was going to help people who had the property. And so through the 19th century and beyond, these organizations became more and more funded and became funded by the local governmental systems. And so it started out as a way for business people to keep their stuff safe, and it grew into the police system. And so by the late 1880s, all of the major U.S. cities had a police force. So let's don't think that police came over from England or Italy or Spain or France or any of those places. The police system in America was created, just like race in America was created. So I wanted to share a little bit about that. So the other areas that we have systemic racism built into the system, or disparities are built into the system, are in areas like child welfare. We call these different things, though, so you don't see them as something bad. You see them as something that's going to happen. So in child welfare, we call it disproportionality. So there's a disproportionate number of black and brown children who don't do as well as white children. But we don't look to see why that's going on. We make assumptions, and we don't try to fix the underlying problems, which are poverty, which are people not getting jobs, people being discriminated against. We don't look at that. In healthcare, we call it health disparities. And if you have been listening to the news lately, in fact, as late as yesterday, the city of Austin, Texas, passed a resolution, as many other cities around the country have been doing since COVID-19, talking about the fact that the health disparities and the health inequities in the black and brown communities are a form of systemic racism. And resolutions have been coming out, calling that out, and creating ways to, task force and organizations are getting together in cities and towns to figure out ways to now combat that. We talked a little bit about that yesterday when we talked about Dr. Damon Tweedy's book, A Black Man in a White Coat. In the juvenile justice system, we call it disproportionate minority contact. It's the large number of black youth in the juvenile justice system. It's not because all those kids are bad. It's because the system is created to push children in from a school to prison pipeline. And that's another situation that needs to be addressed. In the education system, we call it the achievement gap. Well, we talked a little bit about education I don't remember if it was yesterday or day before yesterday, but you can't catch up very well if for 400 years you weren't supposed to learn how to read and write, and you did it anyway, and the system is built to reward white children as opposed to black children. Those are things that we need to look at. And the other thing we talk about in education is disproportionate representation. So that could be children with special needs. That could be IEP plans that we put in place for children, and disproportionately black and brown children fall into the special education system much faster and much quicker. And so that's something that needs to be looked at. And in economic development, we call it hubs, historically underutilized businesses. That is what my business would be considered, because I'm a black female, and so my business is historically underutilized. So we give these things a term, so they fall under a term that we expect them to be there, as opposed to looking to see, okay, so if that's disproportionate, let's call out what's white and what works well. So there are areas that we as business owners, as educators, as elected officials, as people who care about our country, need to address. And one of the, not just because it's the right thing to do, but in the next 20 to 30 years, the majority of our population is going to be black and brown, not white. So in order for things to be set right, we have to go back to the system and fix it. We can't just keep putting Band-Aids on things. You know, when you put a Band-Aid on and you rip it back off, the scab comes off, the pus comes out. It doesn't get uninfected. It stays infected. And so we need an antibiotic that will go in and clean out the irritation and the infection in the entire system. That's what we need to be working on. That's why race matters. That's why my black life matters. And that's why your black life matters. And that's why companies and people who have power today, which is white people, need to work alongside us to fix things. That's all I have for today. We will pick up later. If you have questions for me, or if you are interested in connecting with me to talk about this further, or to get help with making some changes in your company or in your life, or you just want to learn more, you can contact me at racemattersforme@gmail.com. RACEMATTERS, the number 4ME @gmail.com. Thank you so much. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.